The e-cigarettes actually get more toxic while they sit on the shelf.
There's a lot more restrictions on kombucha than there is e-cigarettes. Controversial opinion about a smoke-free generation.
I think it's just a stupid idea. Is that by the mid 1990s, a decade earlier, Philip Morris had working e-cigarettes. They just didn't take them to market for political reasons.
I sat down with Dr. Stanton Glantz, a leading figure in tobacco control. He spent decades pioneering research on secondhand smoke, exposing the tobacco industry's deceptive practices, and helping shape key public health policies around the world. He's authored hundreds of papers, including smoking bans, and championed the fight against nicotine addiction. We talked about the rise of vaping, the challenges ahead in tobacco prevention, and so much more. And boy, does he have some strong opinions. Welcome, Dr. Glantz, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start a little bit about your early work. We were emailing back and forth, and so I read up on the oral history they did, which was great. But what they didn't quite touch on, and what I'd love to know more about, is what initially sparked your interest in this field, and what were some of your early challenges?
Well, I sort of fell into the tobacco issue. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, I really didn't like my parents smoking. It probably gave me asthma. And I had seen the early anti-smoking ads in the 50s and the 60s, but I wasn't setting off to be a public health warrior. And as a graduate student, I had some involvement in the environmental movement, and it worked on some political campaigns. And then in the early 70s, uh, I was sort of frustrated with academia and thought, I had it with universities and publisher pairs, which so I applied for a fellowship with Congress on yeah, called the Congressional Science Research or Congressional Science Fellows Program run by the American Association to the Advancement of Science. And I made it into the finals. And what they did for your interview is they sent you a list of policy topics, and you had 2 days to write a policy brief, and then they flew you back to Washington, and your interview was a mock briefing with a senator. And, it shows how things have changed, but in this whole long list of possible topics, there was only one health-related topic, and that was a proposal by Senator Kennedy to tax the nicotine content of cigarettes. And our understanding of what's called nicotine compensation was just coming online, but basically showing that as you reduce the amount of nicotine delivered by a cigarette, people would smoke more or smoke differently to maintain their nicotine dose. And so I convinced myself this was a really bad idea because raising the taxing the nicotine of content of cigarettes might actually lead to more smoking. So I flew back there and passionately argued the senator had a terrible idea, which I've now learned is not the way to make it in Washington, D.C. And I also wore the suit I got married in, which my wife had made for me, which was orange, my favorite color. And that also doesn't really isn't sort of the DC way. So I ended up not getting the fellowship, which was a good thing because I ended up moving on and having a quite successful academic career, despite my expectations way back then, which is, to show that life doesn't always evolve the way you think it will. And I put that aside and continued the research I was doing at the time as a young assistant professor had to do with cardiovascular function. And then in 1978, there was an effort here in California to pass smoking restrictions through an initiative, which is when you try to pass a law by direct popular vote. And, I didn't like breathing secondhand smoke, and it seemed like a good idea. And the idea that cigarette smoke was a form of air pollution was just coming online. So I just showed up at a meeting to volunteer, expecting to lick envelopes and, walk precincts. But at that point, there were no other scientists willing to do dirty work on the campaign. And I took this thing I'd written back years earlier and showed it to them. And in fact, one of the other things I argued in there was that really the way to reduce smoking was to undermine that I didn't use these words, but to undermine the social acceptability of smoking
Mhm.
by raising the issue of secondhand smoke. And they read this and they thought, wow, you're a genius. And so I ended up in the campaign leadership. And I've kind of been there ever since. So I didn't really set out to do this work, but over time, more and more opportunities presented themselves. And the background I have, which is a combination of life sciences, economics, and engineering, is like the perfect background to work on issues around secondhand smoke. So that's kind of how I got into it. And I mean, the thing that I tell my or told my students and trainees was, life often doesn't proceed the way you think it will. So don't worry about it. Keep moving forward.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm feeling like pretty good about this. So a bit about me, my background. I got my um, bachelor's degree in applied mathematics. Thought I wanted to do medical school, and so I did all the extracurriculars for that. So all of the sciences, I did that, and then worked in the medical field for a bit, and then found myself working in public health. So, like you said, all these things just sort of align, and get a good background for all of it.
Yeah, well, like I started out, I studied aeronautics as an undergraduate and worked for the space agency and actually helped put men on the moon working on several of the Apollo missions. And if you had said to me back then that I would end up running a big tobacco research program and being involved in all this public health stuff, I'd have told you. Just one thing leads to another. And, I think that bringing this broad background and a very diverse set of skills, including applied mathematics, which is something that I wrote a textbook on actually, to bear in the medical area and the public health area. I mean, it was an opportunity to really just bring a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
So you're on the right path.
Well, good to hear. I wanted to talk a little bit too about you mentioned your second hand smoke research. Um, and some of that was pretty groundbreaking and did lead to policy change. What were some of the most surprising findings from that research?
I think the most interesting thing was just how big the effects of secondhand smoke are. And just to finish my life story, I started out in aeronautics uh, at the University of Cincinnati, worked for the space agency for a while, and then came out to Stanford to do my PhD in an area called applied mechanics, which included control theory. And I was, because I'd worked in guidance and control when I worked for the space agency. And I ended up trying to apply the same control theoretic ideas used to control spacecraft to control anesthesia, which actually is a much harder problem than controlling a spacecraft because we understand the basic laws of orbital mechanics, and there's a lot we don't understand even today about biology and how anesthesia works. But but I ended up an assistant professor of medicine in the cardiology division and was doing cardiovascular research. And so the areas that I got involved in the secondhand smoke work were related to cardiology and cardiovascular function. And at the time, most people were focusing on cancer or lung disease. And it turns out that your cardiovascular system is just exquisitely sensitive to secondhand smoke, and you get big changes that are almost as big as you get in active smoking, and they occur very, very quickly within maybe 15 or 30 seconds. So, unlike cancer, which takes years to develop, looking at cardiovascular effects, they're manifest very quickly. And
Mm.
the other thing that we found was that the effects were much, much larger than people thought based on the dose. I mean, if you're a passive smoker, someone breathing secondhand smoke, depending how you measure it, you may get 5 or 10% of the dose of various toxins that active smoker who's actually inhaling the smoke gets. But the adverse effects in terms of messing up your blood and your blood vessels and increasing your risk of a heart attack are maybe a third to a half as big as you get from active smoking. So there's the effects are very disproportionate. And what that means biologically is the so-called dose response relationship. That is, how big is the effect as the dose increases is very nonlinear, that a little bit of exposure really clobbers the cardiovascular system. And as you increase your exposure, the effects get worse, but the line tends to bend over. So I think that was the most surprising result. And that was in the early work we did, which was looking at epidemiology and also doing animal experiments, looking at the effects of cigarette smoke on blood vessels. Those are the kind of things we were finding. Um, I was at a meeting sponsored by the advocacy group Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, which promotes smoke-free laws. And they had invited me to attend this meeting to present some of our secondhand smoke research. And a fellow from Montana came up to me and said, gee, we passed a smoking ban in Helena, which is the state capital. And um, a couple of doctors who worked in the local hospital thought there was a big drop in heart attacks right away. And would I be willing to talk to them because they didn't know anything about statistics, and I've written a couple of books on the subject.
Yeah.
And they connected me to these two guys, and we went back and went through all the human subject stuff and formally collected the data. And what we found was that when Helena banned smoking or put in place smoke-free laws, the heart attack admissions at the hospital dropped by about 40%. It was a huge effect.
Wow.
And this was very controversial at the time because people said it's just too big. Well, it turns out that now that we have a whole lot of studies in this area, that was on the high side. The actual effect is maybe 30%. But still, it was a big effect and it occurred very, very quickly. And that was very surprising result. It was consistent with what you would expect based on the biology, but to actually see it manifest as fewer people ending up having heart attacks, right? I mean, it occurred within a month of the law taking effect. Was That was very surprising. And as I said, it was very controversial, but after that, there were, a whole bunch of times that other people have done similar studies and found the same thing.
What was the actual law that was passed?
It was a pretty strong smoke-free law. It said made workplaces, public places. I think I'm pretty sure it included bars, smoke-free. And
Yeah.
you just had a big drop in heart attack admissions. And the other interesting thing from a scientific point of view is a few months later, a group of concerned citizens who happened to have tons of money brought a lawsuit and got a judge to rule that the law was unconstitutional, so it was suspended, and the heart attacks went back up. So, from a scientific point of view, it was what's called an interrupted time series, and it made the case that the law actually was reducing heart attacks even stronger.
Wow.
And I guess one other uh, really surprising result, again related to heart disease, was I got a call from the Colorado Health Department a few years later, and they said when their smoke-free law went into effect, people thought ambulance calls dropped.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, it's hard to believe that the effect would be so big that you would see it in ambulance calls. But I said, well, and would I be willing to work with the people in one of the local health departments there? I said, yeah, sure. I mean, the hard part of doing these studies isn't the statistics, which I know all about, it's getting the data.
Mhm.
And so I worked with one of the people in a local health department there, and lo and behold, when they put in the smoke-free law, ambulance calls dropped about 30%. And the original law exempted casinos, so they knew where the ambulance calls originated from, and so we found that they dropped about 30% except from casinos. And then a couple of years later, when the law was extended to casinos, ambulance calls from casinos dropped. So, when people talk about smoking and secondhand smoke, the disease most people think of is cancer.
Mhm.
And smoking and secondhand smoke cause cancer, and cancer is definitely a bad thing, but the risks evolve relatively slowly. And in fact, cardiovascular disease, kills as many smokers as cancer. I think it may even kill more of them. And, and those effects occur quickly. And so I think it's really important that people who are interested in looking at the health effects of tobacco use really seriously look at cardiovascular disease as well as the other diseases that smoking causes.
Yeah. I mean, that is extremely enlightening to me. I mean, I know a lot of these things, right? But it's good to put those ideas into perspective. And I had never even heard about, these studies of dropping ambulance rates and dropping heart attack rates by 30 to 40% is incredible. One of the things,
It occurs right away,
yeah,
a month. You don't have to wait years to see the benefits.
which is absolutely incredible. And I think as public health officials, we're kind of I'm part of this younger generation. I think we're all rising in our public health career, and we don't realize the impact that these things have. So, for instance, one of the things I do is the enforcement of the Indoor Clean Air Act, which is just what you said, making sure we're ridding ourselves of secondhand smoke. Um, and it's a hard thing to do. You got to go out there and you got to talk to people, and it's tough. But it's good to know that this really does make a big impact, and it really is important work to ensure that we are, reducing heart attack rates, reducing ambulance calls. All of those things have an impact from the work that we do.
That's right. And there are a couple of other details on that are important. One is that, there are now many studies looking at the effects of enforcing smoke-free environments, not just on heart disease, but lung disease. There's evidence about complications of pregnancy. And what they show is that a strong, comprehensive law that's adequately enforced has a big effect. But if you have loopholes, that you still have an effect, but it putting even with seemingly small loopholes in cuts the effect about in half. So it's really important to have comprehensive smoke-free laws. And today, I mean, most of these laws were written a long time ago now, before the advent of e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products and these other, marijuana and marijuana vapes. And it's very important that these laws be kept up to date
Mm.
and current, and that all of these other products which pollute the air be included in the laws.
Yeah, great. I mean, yeah, amazing points. Um, you touched a little bit about vaping. Have you seen any research about vaping and heated tobacco products as far as secondhand smoke goes?
Yeah, the literature on secondhand exposure to e-cigarettes and heated products is, of course, much more limited than the literature on cigarettes because they haven't been around nearly as long.
Hmm.
But there's no question that these products pollute the air like a cigarette. I mean, you don't need a mass spectrometer or fancy instruments. If you just go somewhere where people are using these products, you can smell it.
Right.
And sometimes it's bad enough that you might get symptomatic in terms of wheezing or burning eyes or a headache or something. So and these new products, the e-cigarettes and heated products, don't create as much air pollution as a cigarette does, because a cigarette, when it's being smoked, you're getting the exhaled smoke that the smoker inhales, plus what's called the side stream smoke, which is the smoke that comes off the lit end of a cigarette or cigar or pipe or something. These new products don't emit side stream smoke because when they're not being used, they're quiescent. But the exhaled mainstream aerosol that people exhale is still enough to pollute the air. And there are several studies showing that you can detect measurable levels of nicotine and other pollutants in the bodies of bystanders. And so, the fact that the level of pollution from an individual stick might be lower, to me, doesn't really matter. The fact is that you are exposing people involuntarily to these toxins, and just like with a cigarette, smokers don't have the right to poison non-smokers, to inflict their air pollution
Right.
on, on others. The same thing is true for e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. Those need to be included in clean indoor air laws and smoke-free home policies. And, people should not have to breathe that stuff to go about their daily lives.
Right. One of the big issues we're having right now is with youth vaping, and we're seeing a lot of e-cigarette use within schools, within school bathrooms, within school classrooms, and a lot of students are afraid to use the bathroom, or if they have to use the bathroom, they're stuck smelling in or inhaling these vapors or these aerosols.
Well,
Are,
I think that's a very serious problem, actually. And, I think if you think back into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as the whole clean indoor air movement, smoke-free movement was really getting going, that's how it was in the beginning is, people could smoke anywhere, people could pollute anywhere. The non-users felt disempowered and unable to do or say anything. And, that's the situation we have with vaping in a lot of places. But, even though youth e-cigarette use is now quite high compared to cigarettes, and in fact, very high even historically.
Mhm.
But the fact is even at its worst, vaping was not something a majority of kids did.
Mhm.
And I think that the vape-free majority needs to simply assert their rights, just like the non-smoking majority asserted its rights to clean up the indoor air. And I've been suggesting this for a while. To the best of my knowledge, nobody's done it, but I think we need to run a campaign to take back the bathrooms and to empower the non-vaping youth to say to the kids who are vaping, go outside.
Mhm.
Don't do this here. I have a right to poop in peace.
Mhm. That's right.
And I mean, I have a grandson in high school, and this is a big problem. I mean, the schools are doing things like taking the doors off the stalls. They're limiting the number of times people can go to the bathroom. And I mean, it's crazy. I mean, and I think what we need to do is to empower non-vaping youth to tell the kids who are using the product to just leave. And, based on the experience that we've had with cigarettes, not only would that mean that the non-users could like poop in peace and breathe clean air, but that will greatly reduce the social acceptability of e-cigarettes and will help prevent kids from using them and help the kids who want to quit. Like we know there's very good data from cigarettes that when people make their home smoke free, when people work in a smoke free workplace, they're less likely to take up cigarettes. And if they do smoke, they are more likely to successfully quit. And while I haven't seen any data looking at those specific questions around vaping, I'm sure the same situation applies. So I think that the public health education and policy implementation that we're doing really needs to take this on and to stop wringing our hands about all the kids that are vaping and start going to the kids who aren't and saying, you need to speak up and we're going to put in place policies to protect you. And I think it's a very different situation to say to kids in high school, you can't vape in the bathroom because we don't want you vaping. Shame on you, you shouldn't be vaping. That's very different than saying like, don't vape in the bathroom. You have no right to pollute the air for your friends.
Mm,
If you want to vape, that's your problem, but go outside and do it away from other living things.
mm. I think that's a good point too. I think I've seen some data to suggest that if students aren't using those products at school, they're limiting their use of it, and oftentimes will quit or not use it as much,
Right,
which are all
right.
good things.
Right, yeah. I mean, for example, with cigarettes again, there's evidence that smoking cessation therapies, things like nicotine replacement therapy or the various prescription drugs that are available, actually work better if people have a smoke-free home and a smoke-free workplace. And I think just as we've harnessed all the non-smokers and the idea of protecting the non-smokers with the beneficial side effect that it's helped reduce smoking, we need to do exactly the same thing with vaping.
Yeah. Should we be worried about this next generation of youth, given that the number of e-cigarette users has really risen and is continuing to rise, at least to the data that I have locally here in Douglas County, as well as just the number of secondhand vape that students are inhaling these days.
Oh yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, if you look at youth nicotine use going back 15 or 20 years, it was consistently falling until about 2015 or 20 yeah, about 2015 or so, when especially after the advent of Juul and the fourth generation e-cigarettes, which are more addictive. And now total nicotine use among youth is higher than it was 20 years ago, and it's because of vaping. So it's a huge problem. And, I think one of the things that's making it worse is the Food and Drug Administration really adopted a very laissez-faire attitude toward e-cigarettes and sort of stood back and let the whole epidemic uh, uh, develop. And now they're sort of trying to shove the genie back in the bottle, but it's really hard.
Yeah.
They're still to this day saying like, well, kids shouldn't use these cigarettes, but we want to keep them available for adults. And that's just a losing message, telling the tobacco companies for years were saying we don't want kids to smoke, it's something adults should do. And the reason they did that is they knew kids were smoking to try to look adult. So if they say it's okay for adults, then it's obviously okay for kids too. So, I think that the FDA just, they say they don't want kids to smoke, to vape. I know people there, they're friends of mine. They're sincere, but you can't build a dam halfway across a river and expect it to do anything. And That's the mistake that the FDA is doing. Now, fortunately, a lot of states, and I don't know the specific situation up where you are, but a lot like here in California, the state health department is going after vaping just like they do smoking. They're not following the FDA's lead on this.
Yeah, a lot of the legislation around Oregon is the flavor ban or flavor restriction. That's a big one kind of going around.
Yeah, well, that's very important because the flavors really are crucial in attracting kids. And there's all, in addition to just that they're fun and, SpongeBob SquarePants flavored e-cigarettes and stuff. But there's evidence that several of the flavors interact with nicotine in a way that makes it more addictive. So
Mhm.
getting rid of the flavors is very important. And if you measure the program effectiveness by how hard the tobacco companies fight it, they hate flavor bans. And so and they've spent probably over $100 million around the country trying to stop flavor bans. And that's the best evidence that they're effective at reducing tobacco.
It's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I mean, one of the rules I've learned in all the years I'm working on this is if the tobacco companies don't fight it, then it's probably not worth doing. 'Cause they know what works, they know what doesn't work, and they don't waste their time and their money fighting ineffective policies. And flavor bans, like here in San Francisco, was where that was the first comprehensive flavor ban on tobacco products, including menthol. And the tobacco company spent a fortune trying to stop it. They forced a referendum on it, lost lawsuits, but it works. It leads to less tobacco use. It's good.
Right. So I have a kind of a two-parter here. You touched on the fourth generation e-cigarettes and how they're actually more addictive. I'd like to know more about that. And then, in addition to that, in October, I have the pleasure of taking several of our confiscated vaping devices from our schools around here to an NMR lab up at Oregon State University, and we're gonna run those things through the NMR and see what pops out. What do you expect us to find? And then can you explain a little bit about the additional addictiveness of these fourth generation e-cigs?
Well, what are you putting in the NMR?
So we have several different brands of e-cigarettes and vape devices, and so we are going to actually put the e-liquid inside and run it through the NMR. I'm not sure if we'll aerosolize it first and then run it through an NMR or just the liquid itself.
Well, it depends what specific instrument you're using, but you're going to find nicotine, you're going to find propylene glycol, you're going to find flavoring agents. And those things are bad. For example, the strong assumption that a lot of people have made and that the FDA continues to make is that, like e-cigarettes aren't as bad as cigarettes. And that's just not true. We just published a paper last week, so the middle of August 2024. It was an experimental study with mice, but we showed that the propylene glycol vegetable glycerin mixture, which is the main carrier in e-liquid, which most people think is safe, actually made cancers grow faster and promoted metastases of cancer. And we were not expecting to find that. We were looking to see what effect the nicotine in the e-liquid would have. But we also did experiments where we exposed the animals to just pure propylene glycol vegetable glycerin as what's called the vehicle. So we were expecting to show no effect of that, and then you put the nicotine in and you get an effect. Well, we did find a nicotine effect, but the propylene glycol vegetable glycerin effect was bigger. And this was looking at studies of isolated cells. It was looking at exposures of whole animals. And the PG, VG, and nicotine didn't cause cancer, we actually injected cancer cells into these animals. But when you did that, it made it grow faster and it made it more likely to metastasize. So, e-cigarettes, and people say, oh, propylene glycol is generally recognized as safe. Well, maybe to eat it, which is
Right.
what that applies to, but inhaling it causes all kinds of problems. There was another paper just published about a month ago that we didn't do, but other people did, that showed if you took pregnant mice and exposed them to propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin aerosol, without even putting nicotine in it, that reduced the number of pups that they had. It caused abnormalities in the blood vessel of the offspring and behavioral problems in the offspring, even after they'd stopped being exposed to the e-cigarette aerosol. So this stuff is pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing that a lot of people don't understand is when you take the e-liquid and you mix it up and you put in all these chemicals and you put it on the shelf. And in fact, when you're doing your studies, you should take note of when each of these was manufactured,
Hmm.
because while it's just sitting there, the chemicals in the e-liquid are reacting with each other and producing more toxic chemicals. The e-cigarettes actually get more toxic while they sit on the shelf.
Mm, interesting. I did not know that. Yeah, and a lot of these devices that we have could be, a year old from last school year. Uh, so we'd expect to find maybe more toxins or more volatile organic compounds.
Yeah, and the different ones as they age, they get more toxic. And in fact, the FDA, when they're evaluating e-cigarettes, one thing that they look at is what happens while they're sitting on the shelf. How long is the shelf life? But they won't share that. It's clear that they understand that they get riskier the longer they sit there. But the FDA refuses to release that data to the public.
Mm,
They should have, just like when you buy a drug, there's an expiration date on the drug.
right.
Okay, there should be an expiration date on e-cigarettes,
Yeah.
where after a certain date, they're not fit for human. Well, they're not fit for human consumption ever, but they become even less suitable for human consumption. So they
Interesting.
need to have they have a finite shelf life.
There's a unique parallel there with the drink kombucha. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but kombucha is a fermented drink that has a like less than 1% of alcohol in it. But when the kombucha sits on the shelves and for a while, just like you're saying, it actually produces more and more alcohol, and so there's a strict shelf life on it, and so they has to be pulled off after that certain point because it becomes an alcoholic beverage and you can't sell it to general public members.
Well,
Um,
that the same rules should apply to e-cigarettes.
And there's a lot more restrictions on kombucha than there is e-cigarettes. Yeah, so incredible. Yeah, and this is amazing. I'm loving our conversation. I'm learning so much from you. Okay, I have a few more questions. So, we touched on this a little bit, but maybe to make it more clear, concise, what's kind of the key takeaways when we compare vaping to smoking? That's like the number one thing I get from the public every single day of the year.
Well, that is like the most important question too, because e-cigarettes are promoted as a less risky product than cigarettes.
Mhm.
And, surprisingly, up until we did it a few months ago, there hadn't been any large scale head to head comparisons of e-cigarettes to cigarettes in terms of actual disease outcomes. And, when you talk to people, including, a lot of my friends and people who are, pretty knowledgeable, and you'd say, how many studies do you think are out there comparing e-cigarettes to cigarettes in terms of actual disease risk? There's been a lot of work looking at what you inhale and, the fact that e-cigarettes don't burn anything. So there's a lot of bad combustion products in cigarettes that aren't in e-cigarettes. But the real question is like, what's the disease risk? And most people, when you'd ask them, they would say, well, it's too soon to tell. We don't know. But in fact, e-cigarettes have been on the market for nearly 20 years. And we went out and did a broad systematic search of the scientific literature. And last October 2023, we found 107 papers, high quality population level studies looking at the association between e-cigarette use and actual disease. And what we found when we combined these using what's called a meta-analysis, which is a fancy word for average, uh, was that for cardiovascular disease, stroke, and metabolic disorder, e-cigarettes were indistinguishable from cigarettes in terms of the risk to people. So this whole argument that they're safer for those diseases just falls apart. It's just not true. Now, for lung disease, we found that they were a little bit less risky than cigarettes, maybe 10 to 20% less risky. But, that's like saying, well, I'm going to jump out of the 45th story window instead of the 50th story
Right.
window. And for oral disease, things like periodontitis and loose teeth and things like that, they weren't quite as bad as cigarettes. But I think that what we now know based on actual disease outcomes, which is really the important thing to be looking at, is that e-cigarettes might be a little bit less dangerous than cigarettes, but it's not a big benefit. The other thing we found is what's called dual use, which is when you use e-cigarettes and continue to smoke cigarettes, that was always more dangerous than just smoking. And depending on the outcome, was 20 to 40% riskier than just smoking. And that's important because around 40 or 50% of people who use e-cigarettes continue to smoke. And so when you take into account the dual use risks, even for things like pulmonary disease, where e-cigarettes by themselves aren't quite as bad as cigarettes, when you look at the actual use patterns in the population, even for respiratory disease, the overall effect of e-cigarettes is no benefit because you have a little bit less disease in the people who just use e-cigarettes, but you have more disease in the dual users.
Mm.
And people just haven't paid enough attention to dual use as a problem. So, if you ask the question at a population level, are e-cigarettes benefiting health? The answer is, even if you just look at adults without worrying about the millions of kids that have been attracted to them, they're
Mhm.
not really bringing much population benefit.
Yeah.
And then when you add in the millions of kids who have started nicotine with e-cigarettes, that they're clearly a bad thing for everybody but the tobacco companies.
Well, I think, I mean, the generation that you worked with, your generation has done a significant, has made significant impacts on the decline of use of just regular cigarettes. I mean, all of data I've seen, especially among youth, is it's just gone, crashing down, which has been great. But now my opinion is that tobacco industry needs more revenue, so they go to other sources like e-cigs. And now what we're seeing is these nicotine pouches like Zyn and other things. And I'm, yeah,
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's very important, I mean, like we have tremendous insight into why the tobacco companies do things. As a result of all the lawsuits in the 90s against the tobacco companies, and continuing to this day, we now have about 100 million pages of internal tobacco industry documents that are available. They're on the internet. If you go to idl.ucsf.edu, that's idl.ucsf.edu, you can go read these internal documents. And what we found was that, contrary to what everybody thinks that e-cigarettes were invented in China in 2005 as a disruptive technology to compete with cigarettes.
Mhm.
That's the conventional wisdom. But if you go into the secret tobacco industry documents, what you find is that by the mid 1990s, a decade earlier, Philip Morris had working e-cigarettes. They just didn't take them to market for political reasons. And if you go back into the late 80s and look at why did the tobacco companies develop e-cigarettes and also the heated tobacco products, it wasn't for harm reduction. It wasn't to help people quit smoking. It's because they realized a lot of smokers were health concerned and were quitting. And
Mhm.
they wanted to develop new products to hold on to those customers. And that's in fact exactly what they've been succeeding in doing with the advent of the e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. And while they weren't looking to build a youth market back then, at least that we could find, that's been the biggest effect. And some people say, "Oh, well, those kids would have smoked cigarettes anyway. It doesn't matter." But that's just not true.
Mhm.
Some of the kids who use e-cigarettes probably would, if e-cigarettes weren't there, probably would have started using cigarettes. But we and others have looked at the psychological profiles, the risk profiles of these kids, and some fraction of them, maybe a third of them, probably would smoke cigarettes if they weren't using e-cigarettes, if you look at their demographics and their attitude toward risk and things. But most of them would probably never start nicotine with a cigarette. And so e-cigarettes have dramatically expanded the market for tobacco products by bringing in a lot of low-risk youth who never would have picked up a cigarette.
Yeah.
And then once they start with the e-cigarettes, some of them go on and add cigarettes. So e-cigarettes have been a huge boom for the tobacco companies.
Yeah, it's amazing. Even when we talk to youth, about this, e-cigarette or general traditional tobacco cigarettes are gross. They're nasty. No one likes a cigarette. That's the public perception of regular tobacco. But when we look at e-cigarettes, those kinds of things, these are fun candy flavors. I mean, kids really love these things, and they think they're water vapor. They think that there's no risk.
That's one thing that just drives my toxicology friends nuts. There's no water in an e-cigarette. It's propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin.
Mhm.
And, I think we need to start explaining to people that these things are gross. They're polluting the air. They're exposing people to all kinds of toxic chemicals that are different. They're different from a cigarette, but they're still pretty bad.
Yeah.
And but the main thing I think is going to the kids who aren't using them, the kids who haven't bought into the industry's rhetoric and saying, you don't have to put up with this. Any more than your parents had to put up with cigarettes when they were your age. And you need to just tell the kids who are using them that they're gross and they should go away. We're still friends. I still like you, but you just have to go outdoors and go away from other living things when you're using your e-cigarette. We don't want to breathe it.
Yeah. When you look ahead into the future, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges, and maybe even some of the opportunities in tobacco control and in public health in general?
The e-cigarette and the advent of these new products is the big challenge because there are well-meaning but naive people, even within the health community, who think they're a good thing for adults. And they're trying to somehow split the baby and say, well, it's okay for adults to use these, a lot of adults use it, but you kids shouldn't. That's just not the way the world works. Saying to kids, do as I say, not as I do, never worked and never will work. And so the fact that we have the Food and Drug Administration out there promoting e-cigarettes to adults and approving some of them or authorizing some of them as appropriate for public health is a huge problem. And, they have been asked, I mean, even they recognize a huge number of kids are using these things. And we have asked them, and other people have asked them, how many kids are you willing to trade off for every adult that switches, given that most of them don't switch? And they've never been willing to answer the question. And I think the fact that the FDA just is basically become an enabler for the tobacco companies in terms of these new products is the biggest problem we face. I think that the place that I have hope is if you look at what the local governments are doing, if you look at what the states are doing, they're out there banning flavors. They're banning menthol, something that, well, the FDA actually tried to ban menthol in cigarettes, and and Joe Biden's White House blocked them, which is appalling. But the FDA has now even approved a couple of menthol e-cigarettes, and it's just terrible. But I think if you look at the history of tobacco for as long as I've been involved, going back to the 70s, the real progress has been made at the local and state level. It's never been at the federal level. And so we just, need to continue, pressing forward at the local level and hope that at some point the federal government will catch up. And I think, the other thing is to start talking to the kids in particular who and the others who aren't using these products and saying you just don't have to put up with that.
Have you seen much data about Zyn or the nicotine pouches? I have not seen a whole lot of research about any of those products.
There is some, that's not an area that I personally followed very closely. Again, if you don't, they're not inhaled.
Right.
So not inhaling is good because you don't get all the pulmonary effects, you don't get all of the irritation due to that. But you're still taking nicotine into your body, and nicotine is a poison.
Mhm. Yeah, pesticide.
It has all kinds of adverse cardiovascular effects. And, again, nicotine doesn't cause cancer, but it makes it grow faster. It interferes with chemotherapies and drugs used to treat cancer and radiation. So nicotine is bad, but
Yeah.
but the thing that's very important to keep in mind with all of these new products is that these have been developed and are managed by these big multinational tobacco companies as a suite of products, which are all marketed and used to complement each other and hold on, keep people addicted to nicotine and make as much money as they possibly can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's hard. I struggle with like these are addictive products that people just can't help themselves from. And once you start, it's that slippery slope of like it's so much harder for me to bring you back from addiction than it is for you just not to start that addiction in the first place. And
Well,
a lot
that's
of
that's true, but undermining, the social acceptability of these products is that's the most effective thing you can do. Making homes smoke free, making homes vape free, the oral products are a little bit more complicated. But to just say to people, you shouldn't, why do you want to turn your body over to these multinational corporations? And, there's good evidence that for both youth and young adults, that people who don't trust the tobacco companies, people who don't want to see the tobacco companies make a lot of money, are less likely to start using tobacco, and it makes it more likely that they'll successfully quit. So being out there educating people about the tobacco industry and how it takes advantage of people is a tremendously potent intervention.
yeah. And with that, what advice might you give to young public health professionals or researchers, in this field, in this area?
I'll just keep going, you know? I mean, when I got involved in this, you could smoke everywhere. You could smoke on airplanes. You could smoke in elevators. And if you had come to me in 1978 when I, got involved in this earnestly, which is what, like almost 50 years ago, and said to me, we're the cutting edge is now like, what about casinos and bars? And and using these products outdoors. I'd have said you're out of your mind. And we have made a huge amount of progress on this issue, and it's just people continuing to put one foot in front of another, to not getting discouraged. And I think we're winning. We've had the e-cigarettes and these other new products have definitely been a setback. The
Mhm.
the FDA acting to empower and enable the tobacco companies has definitely been a setback. But we just have to keep moving. And fortunately, I mean, there's a lot of problems with the law that gave the FDA jurisdiction over tobacco, partially because it was mostly written by Philip Morris. But one very important provision in there, one thing that the health groups got into the law, which is just very important, is it preserves the right of communities and states to regulate where these products are used and sold. And that's unambiguous. The tobacco companies have litigated it a million times and they always lose. And so communities still have a huge amount of power to actually implement effective interventions, and we just need to do it.
Yeah.
And one other thing, I guess, I mean, I'm 78 years old, so I'm like old. And I mean, one advantage of being old is you have perspective, And I think that the we have made huge progress on this issue, and we just need to keep pushing. And I'm shocked at how well, in fact, for all the frustrations over the years and all the attacks and all of the false starts, I'm amazed at the progress that we've made.
Mhm.
And we just need to keep moving.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of academia, and you've been a part of it for many years. And how do you see the role of academia institutions shaping public health policy, and particularly in the context of tobacco control policy?
Academia plays two important roles in all of this. One is doing research and, finding the questions that need answering and answering them, because people in the field, the tobacco companies come up with 5 million excuses and criticisms of public health policy. And that's true for global warming and cell phones and everything else, sugar, everything else. And I mean, at one level, you don't want to waste all your time running around in circles, trying to respond to stupid criticisms. But there are, important questions that come up, and academia provides the opportunity to answer those questions and to provide useful, validated information to hand to policymakers and advocates. For example, this paper we published recently showing that for cardiovascular disease, stroke, and metabolic disease, e-cigarettes are indistinguishable from cigarettes in terms of risk. That's a very important finding.
Mhm.
Years ago, we did a paper showing that when smoke-free laws passed, restaurants and bars didn't go broke, which was like the industry's big argument. And I remember we sent that paper to the American Journal of Public Health, and they said, "Why are you sending this to us? Why aren't you sending it to a journal having to do with restaurant business. And in fact, there are such journals.
Wow.
And he said, this has become the central argument against smoke-free environments. And they said, okay, and published the paper. So research is very important. Training is another role. I mean, I think one of the things probably the thing I am proudest of from my career at the University of California was all the people that we trained and the people who are out there playing a leading role all over the country and all over the world, and that we help get them going. That's very important. And then being available as a public resource to answer questions, to educate the public, to testify, things like that. Those are all tremendously important roles that academia can play. I mean, the one thing academia isn't, it's not an advocacy organization. And we need separate organizations out there dealing with on the ground advocacy. Now, that doesn't mean that professors, people like me, can't help those groups.
Mhm.
But people have come to me over the years and said, why isn't the university out there running these political campaigns? And it's just not universities just aren't very good at that. And it's just not appropriate. And there are organizations that we have that do those things. So, I started out talking about the fellowship I didn't get in Congress. And all I can say is I think the world turned out a lot better for me that I didn't get that. And that I developed a career in academia was very gratifying. I was just up at the university giving a talk this morning. So, um, but that it's a good thing for people who like doing it to do it. That doesn't mean but we need a whole variety of roles. I mean, people who work in health departments, it's a different job.
Mhm.
And we can cooperate, we can help each other. But the people who are on the ground implementing the programs in the field, that's also
Yeah. And the last question, that was excellent. I mean, yeah, I really appreciate your responses. They're very insightful and thoughtful. Um, the last question, and correct me if I've read this wrong, but I believe you have maybe a controversial opinion about a smoke-free generation.
I think it's just a stupid idea.
Okay, well, tell me about it. Yeah.
The it's sort of the antithesis of things like clean indoor air policies where you see an immediate benefit.
Mhm,
And the smoke-free generation, it's basically saying nobody born after a certain date can buy tobacco products. And,
mhm,
there are a whole lot of things that I think that's just a bad idea. First of all, by the very nature of it, it's something that takes effect in the future. That's one reason some people like it and politicians like it is that you're not changing anything really right now. And with all of the problems tobacco causes, we need to be concentrating on policies that are going to improve the situation right now, not 5, 10, 15 years from now. The second thing is I don't think it's going to work in the long run because if you play it out, we would have a situation in a few years where people who are 26 could buy tobacco products and people who are 25 can't.
mhm.
And I just don't think that's going to fly. I think, or people who are 46 can buy them, but not people who are 45. I think the society is going to say, look, you're an adult. If you want to do stupid things, you have a right to do stupid things as long as you don't hurt anybody. I just, I think what's going to happen is as these things go into effect, after a while, people are just going to say these are stupid and repeal them. And the fact is, I mean, what people have said to me, because they're, unhappy that I've taken the position I've taken, is they say, well, but this is just one of many policies and it's part of a suite of policies, and what's wrong with it? And my answer to that is that another thing I've learned over all these years is that the public health people resources are finite.
Mhm.
You can't do everything. We don't have the resources to do everything. And so you need to concentrate your resources on things that will matter. And it take no matter even an ineffective policy that probably the industry isn't going to fight as hard as say a clean and direct law or flavor ban or tax increase. It still takes resources, and that's resources that aren't being put to use implementing policies that do work. So
Mhm.
I think, I just think it's a dumb idea. And I've thought it was a dumb idea for a long time, but I didn't say anything until recently because finally some other people were saying this is not such a great idea. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna tell people what I really think.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good way to do it. Yeah. I thought it was interesting because I saw there was some legislation for the smoke-free generation in the UK. I don't think anything has come about it,
And
but
I mean, the UK is hard. The UK, they've embraced e-cigarettes. And
right.
the smoke-free generation policy in the UK and also in New Zealand, which is another place that it's been pushed, exempt e-cigarettes.
Mhm.
And so they're like, you can't smoke cigarettes, but the kids aren't smoking cigarettes
Right.
much. So it's like, who cares, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, with all of the data that's coming out about how bad e-cigarettes really are, that we're just in the exact same place we were 50 years ago, but now it's not tobacco or cigarettes, it's e-cigarettes. And
Right, right.
it's
And I mean, and
pretty,
the other thing that's important to look at when you're thinking about e-cigarettes is to sort of look at the trajectory. Because, like, if you go back and look at things I wrote like 10 years ago or so, maybe even a little longer, it's like, well, e-cigarettes are not as bad as cigarettes, but they have a little bit of risk. And for a long time, I was saying they're maybe 20 or 30% as bad as cigarettes. And now I'm saying they're 85 or 90%, maybe higher as bad as cigarettes.
Mhm.
And the more we learn about them, the worse they look. And so if you look at the trajectory of evidence on e-cigarettes, it's all pointing in the same direction, and namely that these things are dangerous.
Mhm.
And they may not be quite, they're probably not quite as dangerous as a cigarette, but there's almost nothing out there short of putting a gun up to your head and pulling the trigger that's as bad as a cigarette. And so to say, well, they're not as bad as a cigarette, that's not saying much.
Dr. Glantz, thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights with us today. Your work has truly shaped the landscape of tobacco control, and it continues to inspire public health professionals, not just me, but also around the world. So, for our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about Dr. Glantz's research or get involved in tobacco prevention efforts, be sure to check out all the resources linked in the description, and you can find his blog there as well. Remember, the fight against tobacco and nicotine addiction is ongoing, and it's every effort, big or small, does make a difference. And so here at Everyday Epidemics, we're committed to bringing you the stories, strategies, and science that can help create healthier communities. So thank you for tuning in today for today's episode. And if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who care about making a positive impact. Until next time, I am Mitchell Kilkenny, reminding you to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight. See you on the next episode.